Hey guys, LC Holt here, and this is my update for the week of December the 10th. Today I have a very special show for you. I always say that, but it's true because we're going to be talking about the Zodiac killer. Now it's raining, it's cold where I am, so let me just tell you, it's a good day to talk about an unsolved murder case. And this is a very fascinating unsolved murder case. This is going to be the first in a series of shows that I'm going to do with my buddy Zach Myers. Hey Zach, how you doing, man?
Hey, how's it going, man?
Oh, it's going good. So I was just saying to the audience, we're going to be talking about the Zodiac, and this is going to be a series of shows. This first show is going to concentrate primarily on the case as a kind of a overview, because there's a lot to go into here and a lot of roads you could go down. But before we go down any of those roads, I wanted to make sure that everybody had sort of like a reference point. So you can always come back to this episode and see kind of what we're talking about if we go in later episodes into more specific stuff. So does that make sense?
Yes, and this is very exciting because the Zodiac, really interests me. I know it does a lot of people out there. So I hope everyone out there is really excited about this. I know we are, and let's get the ball rolling.
All right, well, let's get on to the very first case, okay? Now, there are a number of prior cases that some people have kind of retroactively made Zodiac cases, but there are actually only a few confirmed Zodiac cases. The very first one was a case that happened in Berryessa, California, and it happened on a road called Lake Herman Road. And this is kind of a rural road, right? Countryside, there are a few houses around, but not much. You go down Lake Herman Road, and at a certain point, the road kind of turns to the left. And when it turns to the left, you can either follow the road on, or you can pull off into a little area that's like kind of a scenic area. You know, it's just a little pull off. You could get maybe 2 or 3 cars in there.
Yeah.
Now, what we're talking about here, this is the way it was back in December of 1968, so many years ago. It was used as a lover's lane by a lot of the local teenagers. And 2 of these teenagers were Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday. And let's see, she was 16 and he was 17. And this was actually her first date.
That's sad.
Yeah, he picked her up. He borrowed his mom's car, which was like this 2-tone Rambler. And he picked up Betty Lou, and he was going to take her out on their first date. And sometime around 10:15, say, he pulls off Lake Herman Road into this little, like a little gravel dirt turnoff area. And they're sitting there, and they're doing whatever teenagers do on their first date at Lover's Lane. And basically what happened was a little while later, this lady drove by in her car, and she saw the Rambler with its door open and a guy laying on the ground. So, as probably most people would, she didn't stop, but she thought this is a cause for concern. So she, went and called the police. And the police show up. And when the police show up, they find this guy, David Faraday, laying on the ground right outside the door. And he's been shot once behind his ear. And off to the side, when they search, keep in mind, this is like 11 o'clock at night, and this is in the country, dark as hell. They take their flashlights out, and they find Betty Lou Jensen. And she's laying face down in the dirt a few yards from the car, and she's been shot 5 times in the back. So apparently what happened is at some point after 10:15, another car pulled up to where they were necking. A guy approached their car, and it's interesting because in the back right windshield of the Rambler, there's actually a bullet hole that shattered the glass. And this bullet was apparently not a stray bullet. So what it looks like happened, and this is just speculation, is that the killer walked up and told them to get out of the car, and maybe they hesitated, and so he fired a shot through the back windshield, at which point they started to get out. And then he shot David as he was getting out of the car. Betty Lou runs, and he fires 5 times and hits Betty Lou in pitch blackness, right in the back, never misses. Now, this is an interesting point because, again, there's no lights out there. Not even in this turnoff point, there's no lights.
It's in the middle of nowhere.
Yes, Lake Herman Road is really in the country in Berryessa. And so basically what happened was, you know, these 2 kids died. There was no saving them. By the time they got there, essentially, I think he was breathing a little bit. She was already expired. So nobody could tell you exactly what happened because the 2 people who witnessed the event are the 2 victims, and they're both gone, right?
Yeah.
And it's worth noting, too, that this gun was a .22 caliber handgun that killed them. So,
and this guy was a great shot.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting one too. And again, as we go on in this, particularly on to the next case, keep in mind that this was in darkness and he was a very good shot. Okay, so because that comes into play as we get into the to the next case. But before we go there, I mean, what are you thinking about this, man? Can you imagine that you're taking your girl out on her first date and suddenly this wacko?
I don't want to imagine that. I mean, that's horrible. But I mean, it's scary. I mean, that's what makes the Zodiac so fucking scary, is the fact that he's never been caught. No one ever really gets a good look at him, and he kills at random, like, well, most serial killers do. But I mean, he doesn't. What made most people freaked out about him is, you know, he didn't have a type. So the fact that he chose this couple at random, it's bizarre and really creepy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that was only the first couple. Now, keep in mind that was December 20th, 1968, that Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday were murdered. Okay, we have to skip ahead here a little bit for the next case.
Yeah, just a little.
Yeah, July 4th, holiday, 1969. You skip ahead a few, months, but you only have to move about like 3 or 4 miles because it wasn't far from the Lake Herman case. This was over in this case. This happened over in Vallejo, which is right next to the Lake Herman. In fact, you can get to Vallejo using Lake Herman Road. So, so this July 4th night, right? Kids are out. People are shooting off fireworks. There are 2 kids in particular, one named Mike Michaud, who's 19, and then his slightly older girlfriend, who was married, named Darlene Farron. Now, like I say, Darlene was married. She had a little bit of a reputation, apparently. That's not to say anything bad against her, but she was known to go around with guys. And one of the guys she went around with was this 19-year-old Mike Michaud.
Well, and point taken why she was on a date while she was married. So, yeah, that's where she got the reputation.
Right. Yeah, and Mike apparently knew her husband. Her husband was a cook at a restaurant, and Mike apparently knew her husband. So they were all friends, and apparently her husband kind of knew this stuff was going on, it's suggested, but who knows? I'm not going to get into their personal lives and make her out to be something, Fact is, she shouldn't have been murdered. But anyway, so a few miles down the road from the Lake Herman case, there's a little park called Blue Rock Springs. Okay. And so these 2 kids, Farron and Mike Michaud, they are in their car and they pull up, and they're apparently sitting there making out. Now, if we want to get into a little bit of the preamble, according to Mike Michaud, there was a guy who had been following them earlier in the night as they were driving around. And Darlene apparently said to him that this is a guy that's kind of been obsessed with me, and I told him I don't want to be with him. And since she's known to be around guys, to be kind of a swinger in a way, it wasn't unusual, I suppose, for her to have more than one boyfriend and a husband. So she apparently had another boyfriend, and according to her, he was the guy who was following them around. Now, Mike Michaud says that she said his name was Richard. But if you've seen an interview with Mike Michaud, and there's a few out there, it seems that Mike Michaud may have been impaired in some way because of the injuries that he sustained, which were substantial. So he has a lot of memory problems, and he seems to kind of he'll say, you know, he's telling the story, and then he'll say one thing and then kind of contradict it a few minutes later. So it's a little hard to decipher what Mike is talking about when he talks about this particular incident. But back to Blue Rock Springs, two of them are sitting there. Mike Michaud says that somebody pulled up behind them and sat there for a second. And Darlene said something to the effect of, "Oh, he's back." And then that car drove away. Jesus Christ. Drove away. And so Mike Michaud said then another car drove up, and he's not sure if it's the same car, but it might have been the same car. But keep in mind, he also said that the car that drove up might have been a compact car, or it might have been a Cadillac. So his memory of what the car was is a little bit clouded. But, you know, you got to give him a pass, because I'm about to tell you what just happened to him, and it's pretty rough. So somebody gets out of the car, man. He's got a flashlight, and he walks over to the passenger side window and shines the flashlight in at Mike Michaud, who is in the passenger seat, and Darlene Ferrin, who's behind the driver's seat. And Mike apparently assumed, rightfully so, that it was a cop, because the park was closed. They didn't really like kids sitting out there. It's a holiday, so they're probably kind of scoping out the place and making sure nobody's fighting or doing drugs or anything. So he thinks it's a cop, so he rolls down the window. And, you know, as soon as he rolls down the window, the guy with the flashlight starts firing a gun. And he proceeds to shoot the ever-loving hell out of Mike Michaud and Darlene Ferrin. I mean, he shot them a lot. And according to Mike Michaud, who saw the guy's face, he was 5'8", had glasses, brown hair, about 200 pounds, and he said he was very nondescript looking. He wasn't handsome, he wasn't ugly, he just looked like a guy, and had glasses, so you couldn't, and you have to keep in mind, the guy had a flashlight in his face, and the guy's shooting him too. So how many details are you really going to remember in the amount of time this has taken?
I mean, 1 minute you think the guy's a cop, and then you're trying to give the guy your ID, and the next minute you're being shot at. So it's kind of hard to kind of get a description of the person.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that he shot Mike Michaud, and Mike Michaud actually struggled his way into the back seat, and apparently the guy walked away, and then something, whether Michaud made a sound or Darlene did, he stopped and he came back and he shot him some more.
Yes.
So he really wanted to make sure they were dead. And Darlene was fatally wounded, and Mike Michaud was shot many, many times, but he actually managed to survive, and that's how we know what happened in that case, as opposed to the Lake Herman Road case. Now, the reason I wanted to point out the dark element of the Lake Herman Road case is because we know from Mike Michaud that the killer had a flashlight. And apparently the flashlight might have been attached to the gun, which meant that where he pointed the flashlight is where the bullets would go. So now I don't think Mike Michaud is entirely sure if the flashlight was attached to the gun or if they were two separate things. Sometimes he says that it had a silencer on it, and sometimes he says that it didn't. So, not entirely the most reliable, of witnesses, unfortunately. They got a call that came in, and it reported gunshots out at Lake Herman Road. And so the cops came and they found Mike Michaud, laying in the dirt a few feet from the car. Somehow he managed to get out of the backseat of the car, crawl over to the dirt, and that's where he kind of fell. and then Darlene was still in the driver's seat. Now, something apparently Mike Michaud said was that when they pulled up before the attack, that Darlene, you know, turned the headlights off, as you would do. You know, you turn off the car. They left the radio running, but they turned the headlights off, because why would you sit there with your headlights on? Well, when the cops came, the headlights were on. So what Mike Michaud says is that Darlene Ferrin flashed the headlights a couple times after the attack in order to try and get someone's attention, which it did not really work, because it was actually the call, the distress call of gunshots that drew the police there. And then that's where they found them. And Mike Michaud was taken to the hospital. Darlene was still alive, and apparently the cop tried to get some information from her and said what happened, and her lips were moving, but she couldn't say anything. Now, it's a shame that she couldn't say anything, because if it's true that the guy who was following them earlier was the same guy that shot them, then that would mean Darlene knew who the killer was, because she apparently was aware of who was following them. So, I mean, that's kind of a good point. Unfortunately, it's kind of a moot point, because, you know, Darlene died and was never able to convey anything to the police one way or the other. It's also interesting.
A huge lead in the case, the fact that the male survived.
Yes, and that's an important point, because even if you think back to the Lake Herman case, you know, David Faraday died, but he was only shot once, and, you know, Betty Lou Jensen was shot 5 times. In this case, they were both shot a bunch, but she definitely was the target and was the one that died. Mike Michaud was shot quite a few times, more than David Faraday, but he did survive. So the killer seems to be really focused on killing the woman, and the guy is like trying to kill him just as quick as he can possibly do, so he can get to the
He doesn't want the male to intervene.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. Yeah. It's also worth noting that in this Blue Rock Springs case, the Vallejo case, that this was the first time that the killer called the police.
Yes.
And he drove over to, I think it was like a car, it was, I don't remember where it was, a gas station maybe, where there was a payphone. And
it was a gas station with a payphone in front of it.
And he called up the police, and this lady named Nancy Stover, who was a police dispatcher, you know, answered the call. And the killer said basically that, well, I can read you exactly what he said. Okay, so apparently, and now keep in mind that back then 911 calls were not recorded. So you just had to go on the memory of the dispatcher. But she took down the report instantaneously. So we're pretty sure this is what he said, because she wrote it right down. I mean, it's not like she held it in her memory for 6 months and then wrote it down, you know. So what she says that he said was that he said, I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway to the public park, you'll find the kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. And I also killed those kids last year. And that's referring to Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday. So here he's taking credit for that. Because, you know, one thing we'll learn about Zodiac is he loves to take credit for things. He will not whether the fucker did the thing or not, it doesn't matter. He'll take credit for it. So, oh yeah, and that's an interesting one, because that's the one with the infamous goodbye that Nancy Stover likes to talk about. Because he says this, and then she said at the very end, after he made this statement, that he said, goodbye, and hung up, as a way of taunting her, you know, as a way of freaking her out, which I'm sure it did.
Keep it interesting.
Do what?
He's trying to keep it interesting. Right,
because you know this guy is obviously not all there, right? I mean, he's on a planet all his own. This killer, who, by the way, is not known as the Zodiac yet. We'll get to that. We'll get to that later. Right now, he's just the guy that killed Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, and Darlene Ferrin, and tried his damnedest to kill Mike Mageau, but couldn't quite cut it there.
He's just a random psycho at this point. We don't know who he is.
Right. He's a guy that's killed two people. Well, it's killed one person and taken credit for two other previous murders that happened the previous year. So he did start after that to write letters. And he wrote he wrote 3 letters, but they were all the same letter. He wrote 3 identical letters, and they were handwritten, and they were sent to 3 different newspapers in San Francisco. And I think that's worth noting. He actually sent one to the Vallejo, I think it was called the Vallejo Times Herald or something to that effect. But so he sent one to Vallejo, but then he also sent 2 to the San Francisco Examiner and Chronicle. And each of the letters were identical practically, but along with those letters, he sent 3 different coded messages, cryptograms, basically. And he said that in his letter that he sent, he said that within that coded message, you're going to find my name. Actually said you're going to find my identity. Okay. So I actually can show you, let's see if I can show you these particular cryptograms. Yeah, so that's what the cryptograms look like. And it's worth noting that after a few days that this actual coded message here was deciphered. Okay, it was deciphered by a history teacher and his wife. And they took 2 days over a weekend, and they figured out what this said. And I will read you what this said. That was Donald and Betty Harding is who decoded it. They're from Salinas, California. So within this message, it says, I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and they have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. And then at the end of this, actually, there are a bunch of random letters that don't seem to add up to anything. They thought at the time that maybe that was just leftovers. But yeah, I mean, it's a string of letters, and some people go into the.
Tell from the letter, he's a nutcase.
Oh yeah, I mean, at this point, you can probably tell this guy's not firing on all 8 cylinders. So there, and that cipher was called the 408 cipher because there are 408 characters in it. Now, it's interesting to note that there were other letters and other ciphers, but we're going to do another episode in this series in which we'll go over those in more detail. I just wanted to point that out to you because that was the only cipher that was ever decoded, and I wanted to let you know.
How amazing is it that it was decoded? Because honestly, I think when they first caught that, they didn't think anybody, it probably, it seemed like nonsense. And then some random couple actually decodes it is pretty incredible. Like, I think that's, they must be pretty intelligent to be able to decipher that.
Yeah, and these were just average people, They, like I said, it was a history teacher and his wife. And what they determined was that it was a substitution code, which is, I mean, I'll explain that very briefly, but basically, if you have a key that tells you what to substitute, you can figure out the letters. Usually, it's like moving the letter in the alphabet 3 or 4 spaces. So when you see, say, the letter A, that would mean that it actually stands for the letter D. And so that's what they used. They used a couple other tricks in there. Like, one of the things that they just assumed that proved to be correct is that he would use the word kill.
Oh, yes. And the 2 symbols that matched, they kind of, you know, figured out after a while what that word was. And it was a 4-letter word, obviously, that had 2 symbols that were the same. They kind of figured out that it meant kill.
Yes. Yeah, they just looked for repeating symbols that were throughout, and they found this. I think it was like a square that was cut in half, and then some sort of a letter. But they found those, and they figured out, well, that must be double L's. So that must be the double L's that are in kill. And then I think they assumed that he would start the letter with I because he was narcissistic. You know, they figured, well, this guy wants attention. It's all about, you know, me, me, me. So the first symbol is a kind of a triangle. So then they said, well, okay, well, the triangle stands for I. And then they started going through it like that. And eventually it came together into that message that I read you. So you had Blue Rock Springs. That was in July 4th. Now these dates are significant for a couple different reasons. You have the first killing in December of '68. You have the next killing July 4th of 1969. And now in September the 27th, actually, of 1969, there is another incident. So the previous 2 cases, in the dead of night, this killer, who is still not calling himself the Zodiac yet, even though he has used his symbol in the letters to the Examiner, the Chronicle, and the Herald. And the symbol is a circle that has like a cross inside of it. It looks like a crosshairs. Okay. So right now he's just known as that symbol. Okay. So then after these 2 incidents, we have to go to a place called Lake Berryessa. And Lake Berryessa is in Napa Valley, California. It was 6 o'clock or so at night. There's a young couple, Brian Hartnell, who is 20, and Cecilia Shepard, who is 22. And so they're going to go down to this little Lake Berryessa park. And what Lake Berryessa is it's a reservoir. And it has like, you know, little areas where you can picnic, and there are hills and there are trees, and it's kind of wide open, but there are some trees and stuff. And so they go down onto this little island that when the water is low, there's a little spit of like sand that makes it into a peninsula, and you can get to the actual island. So they walk across this little sandy peninsula. They have an island over there. They sit down on the shore of the island. They spread out a picnic table, and they're just kind of chilling and enjoying kind of the September day, because it's, again, it's 6 o'clock, so it's in September, so it's still light out. And so they're sitting there talking. He's laying on his back, and he's facing toward Lake Berryessa, toward the water. She's sort of laying on his stomach a little bit. She has his arms kind of on his chest, and she's looking at him face to face. So if he's facing the lake and she's facing him, that means that she's facing the you know, the hills behind them, the park itself, the trees, and all that. And so as they're talking, she starts to become slightly distracted, and she says, "There's somebody over there." And apparently, from what she said a little later, she first saw someone like 200 yards away, fairly good distance. And it was just a guy that was walking. And then, so she kind of made note of it, but it wasn't like it was distressing. But apparently this guy started to come closer and closer. And so then she told Brian, you know, hey, there's a guy over there and he's watching us. And Brian is laying there like, you know, well, okay. And a few minutes later, she says that he went behind a tree. And Brian,
see, he doesn't think anything of it because he thinks it's just a guy, you know, taking a leak behind a tree, and, you know.
Right. I mean, this is a public park, you know, so it's not cause for horrible concern. And you know, there are hills and there are trees up there, and apparently he's kind of thinking, oh, well, he went behind a tree and it's way off up the hill somewhere, because she didn't say where he was or how close. She just said there was a guy over there. And then she says, oh God, he's got a gun. And that's when Brian turns around and realizes when she said he went behind a tree, she didn't mean the trees that were yards, hundreds of yards away. There was a tree that was like 15 feet away. And he was that close when she said he went behind a tree. So by the time Brian gets up and turns around, there's a guy walking toward them with a gun out, and he's like 5 feet away suddenly. So you can imagine that's a little bit of a shock when you turn around and you think somebody's further away and suddenly they're right there. Not only is that cause for shock, but also the man is wearing a strange getup.
Yeah, and he's wearing a hood over his head, a mask.
Yeah, it's sort of like a square hood, and it's got a bib that comes down in the front and apparently in the back. And an interesting detail is he has like sunglass shades clipped onto the eye holes. So you can imagine a mask, this like square mask. If you've seen the thumbnail for this particular video, that's exactly that's the artist rendering of what Brian Hartnell described. And on the bib, there's this little 3x3 circular symbol, and it's the same symbol that was on the letter to the Chronicle, the Examiner, and the Times Herald. It is what would later become known as the Zodiac symbol, the crosshairs. So suddenly there's a guy walking up to him. The guy has a gun pointed on him. And he tells them, just relax. I'm not trying to do anything. I just need your money and your car keys. And so it's sounding like a robbery. He says, I escaped from a jail. Sometimes Brian is not quite sure. He thinks he might have said Montana or in Colorado, but either way, we later learned this is a bullshit story, so it doesn't really matter. But he says that he escaped from a jail in Colorado or Montana, and he killed a guard getting away, and now he's just trying to get to Mexico. So he's going to take their money and their car, and that's all there is to it.
And the sad thing is the male that he was saying it to only had 75 cents in his pocket.
Right, exactly. This poor guy, he's just trying to and keep in mind, these two were not lovers or anything. They were just friends. They had dated previously, but they weren't like the other couples in that they were dating right now. They were just kind of hanging out, apparently. And they were both college students. They were a little bit older than the other victims, with the exception of Darlene Ferrin. Cecilia Shepard was 22, and so was Darlene. So they're slightly older than the other one, but still it's a couple. Big difference is it's in the middle of the day. So anyway, this guy with the hood tells them, I'm going to tie you up. Since he's not going to get any money from him other than, as Zach said, 75 cents, he's going to tie him up and leave him there. So he takes out like these lengths of plastic clothesline, and he has Darlene tie up Brian. And then he ties up, Darlene, Jesus, I'm mixing up my cases. He has Cecilia tie up Brian, and then he ties up Cecilia. And he realizes that Cecilia tied Brian's hands really loosely. Now, it's worth noting at this point that Brian apparently turns to Cecilia and says, I think I can get that gun. And she's like, no, don't do that. And then the guy steps back.
Yeah, that was his one and only chance. He threw it away.
Yeah. So the moral of the story is, if you want to go for the gun, don't tell your girlfriend first, even though they weren't boyfriend and girlfriend.
Just do it.
Yeah, just go for it. Don't get her approval if you're going to try it, because she might say, no, don't do it. And the guy might step back, which is exactly what happened in this case. So this guy with the hood winds up hog-tying both Brian and Cecilia. He ties their hands together, and then he ties the rope around their ankles and ties their hands to their ankles. So they're hog-tied, laying on their stomach. And at this point, Brian says, well, was the gun even loaded? Because he thinks that maybe the gun was just used to scare them.
Well, he read somewhere when he was, a little younger, in school, that a lot of in robbery cases that the suspects don't use a loaded gun because they don't want that extra charge on them. And which is unlike that in a lot of cases now. But he was a little naive about that. And when he asked the killer, you know, showed him a loaded magazine, and you know, he was wrong.
Right, because the killer took the clip out of the 45 he's holding, and he showed it to him, and it was loaded. So he was definitely holding a loaded gun, but he wasn't intending to use it, not like the other cases, because he put the gun in a holster and he pulls out a 12-inch knife, and without saying another word, proceeds to stab Brian Hartnell 5 times in the back. And then after that, he goes over to Cecilia and he starts stabbing her. I think it was somewhere between 10 and 20 times. There are different reports as to how many, but he stabbed her a lot more, which goes with the Zodiac's MO in so much as get the guy out of the way and then really kill the girl. It seems to be his thing.
Oh, yeah.
And so he stabbed her repeatedly. And then he stood there and Brian pretended to be dead. And then he just hears the guy walking away. And the killer walks away, leaves him there. And what's horrible about it is that they're out there, neither of them are dead, but they've been stabbed and they're seriously injured. And so, you know, and they're tied up, they're hogtied. So day starts to turn into night. And there's no one around because this is after Labor Day. The summer festivities in the park are past. There are some fishermen out on the lake. Brian says he tries to call to them a few times, and they keep going. So can you imagine laying out there having been basically mortally wounded?
That would be really terrible. And like you said, you know, he called several times for different people, and nobody came. And he did see one boat kind of passing by, and he started yelling and shouting as, you know, loud as he could, and they turned the motor off. And he kind of thought he saw 2 people in the boat, and he thought that maybe they were coming over, and they kind of seemed to listen for a few minutes and turned their motor back on and kept going. So he didn't really, he pretty much figured at that point that I'm not going to get help. You know, I need to do this myself.
Yes, and thankfully that father and son that was in that boat actually did go to the park headquarter office and report the 2 kids out there, because otherwise with everyone else ignoring them, they might have just laid out there and died. Because basically
he went every like 5 feet and then fell 5 feet and then fell, and then he finally got a little further up the street, and then he I think he said in an interview that he had to hunch over, you know, to hold his chest and then not walk as fast so he could kind of not take breaks. And when he finally got up to like a road that park rangers and stuff would use, that's when he saw the headlights. And when the man came out of the truck, he was certain that it was the killer again. It was a kind of a same build, you know, a shadowy figure. I think he was traumatized personally, and he just was afraid that it might have been the killer coming back. But sure enough, it was the park ranger that, you know, like LC said, was that the fisherman, you know, reported.
Yeah, and can you imagine that? Because he managed to get untied enough to walk, and with all those injuries, going 5 feet, and it was 500 yards to the road. So you could just take those 5 feet things and then drop. And this is at night. It's gotten dark and it's starting to get cold. And he's just trying to get help for himself and Cecilia, who is still alive at this point. And like Zach said, he sees, and my heart would drop, because it would be like crossing the Sahara Desert trying to get to that road. And then you finally get to that road and you think the guy's come back for you. I mean, it's pretty terrifying. You know what I mean?
No, that's totally terrifying. I wouldn't even know what I would do in that situation. But, you know, luckily it was the park ranger and he was saved.
Now, Brian was driving a car that Volkswagen made called a Carmen Ghia. And when the cops got Brian and Cecilia and took them to the hospital, they walked up to the Carmen Ghia, and what they discovered was that the Zodiac had gone back to the couple's car and had written something on the side of the car, a message, because we know that the Zodiac loves messages. And now I'm going to show you this message.
Yes, and that is a very iconic image right there of the car door, you know, showing that his signature there on top, the location right under it, the dates, and you know, how he killed him.
Yes, because the dates there, remember what I was telling you about, remember the dates. That's December 20th, 1968. So that's Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday. So that was the first one we described. That's July 4th, 1969 is the second date. And that was Mike Migeot and Darlene Ferrin. And now below that, September 27th of 69 at 6:30. So he's even giving you the time, and that's the case we just described at Lake Berryessa. And then, of course, he adds at the bottom, because it was different than the other ones, presumably by knife.
And that's a real, like I said, a real iconic image. That, and you know, by this point, there's been 2 survivors.
Yes, and they're both men. They're always the guys survive, never the girls.
Well, and like you said, obviously his, you know, he's a lot more brutal with the women.
Yes,
You know, that would make a lot of sense why there's no women surviving this.
and like Blue Rock Springs, he drives into Napa, and he goes actually a couple blocks from the police station, and he goes to a payphone, and he picks it up, and he makes another 911 call. And this time, he tells the operator, he says, I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. They're 2 miles north of park headquarters, and they were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Ghia. I'm the one that did it. He dropped the phone. And they actually managed to send out some people, and a radio reporter found the phone dangling off the hook, and it was still wet with sweat, like the guy had just left. And keep in mind, only a few blocks from the police station. So again, he's, you know, thumbing his nose at him. He's saying, I was right here. And
he's arrogant.
yes, that's the one thing about Zodiac that is always consistent. He is a very, very arrogant guy, and he loves to brag and take credit for what he did. I mean, even so much as leaving the dates on the car and with the letters. Like I said, we'll do a show where we go into more of the letters, but the letters really will describe just how much of a braggart he is. So there's that case, and that was Lake Berryessa. Again, you know, a pretty terrifying situation, man. I mean,
you know, and I mean, he is a very strong individual. Like you said, you know, the fact that he can get up every so feet and you know, make it down there, and that's pretty tough. You know, you know, I don't even know, you know, wow. I wouldn't know what that situation would feel like.
You know, something happened to me one time, and I was already kind of interested in the Zodiac case, and I'd read Robert Graysmith's book about it. And I was with a girlfriend one time, right? And we went to this park, and this park had a river beside it. And she was she kind of had her head in the clouds when she was talking. She was wasn't aware of her surroundings. And I am kind of always aware of my surroundings. So I'm walking with this girl along the river, and I pass through this parking lot. And when I look up, I see a guy passing us going the other way, walking. You know, we're walking one way, he's walking the other. And for a second, my eyes met his eyes, and I can tell you the look in his eyes was not like anything I've ever seen before or since, and not in a good way. So as me and my girlfriend are walking and talking, I kind of look, we're a little further up on a hill, and then the hill kind of falls down into the river. And I look over and I see this guy, the same guy is down there by the riverside. And I start walking. So she's talking and I'm paying attention to her, but I'm also keeping my eye on this guy because, again, we made contact and I didn't like the way he looked at us. And so what happens is I start walking one way with her, and she's following along talking, and he's walking that way. And so then I notice this, so I stop and I turn back like I'm walking the other way, and she's following me, she's talking, still completely oblivious to him, and he starts to walk back that way. And I do this one more time, and every time I go one way, he follows the same way, and he's probably about 50 yards away down nearer the riverside. So I'm like, okay, I don't like this. So I start telling her, okay, we're gonna leave. And so me and her start walking, and our car is parked a long way away, okay? So we have to walk up a hill. So I start walking with her back up the hill toward the main road where our car is parked, and this guy's walking behind us. And he walks and he gets in his car, and he starts driving, and he passes us as we're walking up this road. And he stops in the middle of the road, a few feet in front of us. And I'm just looking at him. And then after a few minutes of just sitting there, he pulls away and he keeps going. Now, I thought to myself, this is going to be a fucking Lake Berryessa. Like, why would this man have any reason to do that? Why would he follow us like that in an empty park?
Yeah, I don't think he recognized you from your films. I think he had different intentions.
Yes, and you have to keep in mind, this is prior to I've done a couple movies, but I hadn't done You're Next or anything. So this is not like I'm known, you know, as a horror movie actor. So this guy's not caring about me in movies. He's caring about this couple.
He's creeping.
Yeah, he's creeping. And the fact that when we started walking away and he went to his car confirmed to me that he's following us. And then when he stopped in the road, I'm like, oh, fuck no. But he drove on. We went and got in our car. We drove away. Never seen him since, thankfully. So, and I don't live in that part of the country anymore. So chances of me seeing him again are pretty scarce. But
that's pretty creepy. It sounds very similar to a lot of weirdos and the whole Zodiac case in the park. So that's pretty creepy.
Yeah, and the only reason I mentioned that is that's sort of like my Lake Berryessa story. Only we didn't get stabbed and murdered, and it certainly was not the Zodiac. This guy was way too young.
Luckily, you weren't stabbed and attacked, so that's good.
Well, I mean, who knows what this guy was thinking? But anyway, we'll jump back now into the Zodiac now that Elsie Holt's personal creepy-ass anecdote time is out of the way. So the next murder actually takes place very short period of time later. Keep in mind, these murders are getting closer and closer and closer together. October the 11th, 1969 in San Francisco. There's a neighborhood out there called Presidio Heights, and it's next to a very well-known park that has a wall around it called the Presidio. There is a cab driver named Paul Stein. He's 29 years old. He picks up a guy in the theater district, and the guy asks to go to Washington. I can't remember the street he said. It was Washington and something. And then, so that's what he went down in the logbook. But apparently, the passenger, who turns out to be the Zodiac killer, says, go one block up. So he winds up on Washington and Cherry. And when he stops at Washington and Cherry, and the taxi driver puts the vehicle into park, the guy pulls a 9mm Luger, same thing that was used on Darlene Ferrin and Mike Michaud, and blows the guy's head off from behind. He just puts the gun to the back of the cab driver's head and pulls the trigger. So then he gets out of the cab. He goes around, opens the passenger door, and 3 kids from a house across the street on the corner look out the window, and they see him doing something to the cab driver. And then he closes the door, he walks away up, I believe he walked up Cherry Street. And so they call the cops. Cops arrive, Paul Stein is dead, shot point blank in the back of the head. For some reason, and this is still a mystery, the initial reports to the police cruisers go out that you're looking for a black male that's 5'8".
And that's sad, that's sad. A lot of racism was going on during that time, and I think they just, naturally assumed, and that's terrible.
Yeah, well, whatever the case may be, whether the kids mistook it, whether the cops wrote it down wrong, that's what went out. And so the cops are combing the area in their squad cars looking for a black male. And there's one cop in particular who's driving along, and he sees, just a few minutes after the murder, a man lumbering down the sidewalk. And the guy's got glasses, he's got a crew cut, he has like a jacket and slacks and boots. And so the cop slows down, but because they're looking for a black male, he goes, well, it's not a black guy, that's for sure. And he keeps driving. Well, by the time he gets to the actual crime scene, the cops tell him, oh no, the description was wrong. We're trying to change it. It was a white male. And the guy goes, well, I think I just passed him. So, you know, so they turn around, but the guy's gone. Now, whether that was actually the Zodiac killer that the cop saw, who knows? Sometimes the story seems to change a little bit. Like some people say that he said that he stopped the guy and talked to him, and the guy said that somebody ran past me into the park.
Yes, in certain cases, it says that the cops talked to an individual that was walking down the street and said, oh yeah, somebody ran by into the woods. But in other cases, you know, it changes a little bit.
Yeah, and this cop that this happened to, allegedly, he says that he didn't stop him. He says that the guy turned and started to walk like he was going up toward a house there on the street. He never saw the guy go into the house, but he assumed that the guy was going toward his house, and so he just kept going. So there's a little bit of controversy on, you know, what actually happened there. But apparently he saw some guy and didn't stop him in any sort of way that would be significant to solving the case. We'll put it that way. Something that resulted from these three kids is when they saw him down across the street, they actually were able to describe what he looked like to a police sketch artist, and that created the first sketch of what the Zodiac looked like, which I can show to you. Would you like to see, Zach?
Let's do it. Yes, there it is.
So that is the famous sketch that was described by the kids. Now, there's something I want to say about this particular sketch. This sketch is of a white guy with dark rimmed glasses in the late 60s. So what do we know about the late 60s?
Every single male, for the most part, wore dark frame Buddy Holly glasses.
According to this sketch, Buddy Holly was the Zodiac killer.
Well, see, okay, let's not dismiss this. Okay, he very well could have been.
So yeah, Buddy Holly could have been the Zodiac killer.
Play his songs backwards, and he admits to being the Zodiac.
You know, and that's probably something we'll get into on the letter and cryptogram, or maybe even when we do the show about the suspects, is because it's like, if you look at some of these things and you turn it upside down and hold it up to a mirror and then set it on fire, it will tell you that Elsie Holt is the Zodiac killer. You can put together...
That was a confession, everyone.
Yeah, I must confess that prior to my birth, I killed 5 people.
You look really good for your age, by the way.
I know, man. I do.
For killing people in the 60s, you know, that's pretty good.
Yeah, me and Ted Cruz, man. We did it. But no, anyway, what I was talking... You liked that one, didn't you? Well, anyway, what I was talking about was that sketch doesn't really do very much for me. It's very famous, and every time a new person says that their father was the Zodiac killer, which that's happened a lot, they'll always show a picture of their father in 1969, looking like every other white guy did in 1969 with a pair of dark rimmed glasses, and then they'll put that composite up next to it and see, it's just like it, you know. But it doesn't really do very much for me because like there would be 1,000 Zodiac killers if you put the men, men of that age, their picture up from 1969 next to that composite. You would have so many fucking Zodiac killers. We would all be dead. Like Charles Manson said, we'd be stacked like cordwood. You know what I mean? So the long story short is that is a composite that was done, that was described by 3 kids from the upstairs window of a house across the street from a crime that was committed in the dark. So not necessarily the most reliable. So I wouldn't convict anybody based on their resemblance to that sketch. That's
No,
all.
I wouldn't either.
But the officer who stopped the guy, or didn't stop the guy, just saw him, drove past him, whatever the officer did in the end, he said that he looked like that sketch, that the guy that he saw resembled it. So I don't know if that was the Zodiac. Maybe that is kind of what he looked like. In one of the letters, he said that when I do my thing, I don't look anything like the sketch that you guys have. So maybe it's somehow a disguise. Maybe he's bullshitting you, which he was known to do quite often.
Yeah, a lot of people think the Zodiac was full of shit, but I mean, he obviously did kill the people that that we know about.
Right, and that right there, what we've described, are the cases that are officially credited to the Zodiac killer. Paul Stine was the last case that we absolutely know that the Zodiac committed, and the reason we know that, the Zodiac sent a letter with a scrap of Paul Stine's bloody shirt in it, and that's what apparently he was doing when he was messing around the front seat of the car when the kids saw him, was he was cutting off a piece of Paul Stine's shirt before he left. And again, even more than Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard attacking people in broad daylight and using a knife, this breaks the pattern in an all new way, because now he's killing a cab driver, one person, not a couple. It's in the city, and he's using a gun again. So now he's doing all kinds of things that he didn't do before. So he seems to know that patterns are what get you caught, and he's breaking the pattern however which way that he can. So anyway, that is about all we can do for today, because we've about run out of time. But we managed to get in all of the cases, and really we're just scraping the tip of the iceberg with these cases, because you could do an hour on each one of them and go into all the details. But I wanted to give kind of an overview. So thoughts on these cases, Zach? What are you thinking about the Zodiac cases that we described, the official ones that we described today?
They're horrifying and interesting at the same time. There's so much, but so little we know about the Zodiac. And like you said, the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to go into on this case. Like you said, we will go more into information about this case and about the Zodiac, and the letters and stuff. But it's interesting, and he's getting more cocky in his killing, and like you said, going from isolated areas to a little bit more open areas to being right out in the open in the city, and obviously 3 kids saw him, so he is getting a little cocky, but we did never catch him. So.
And he finally ends up in San Francisco, which, judging from his letters, is the place he kind of wants to end up, because he did these rural killings, but he seems very interested in being famous in San Francisco. And I think it's telling that the last official case took place in San Francisco, right in the middle of the city with Paul Stine. But anyway, now that we've finished our overview, this is the first of several parts. Who knows how many parts there'll be? We'll just have to see, of this Zodiac series. I hope you all enjoyed watching. Zach, did you have a pretty good time this time?
I had a great time, and I hope everyone out there had a blast watching, and I can't wait for the next one. Thanks for having me, everyone.
Yeah. Well, man, I appreciate you coming on the show, and I appreciate all you guys watching. And I will be back next week with an interview, and then pretty soon we'll be doing another part of the Zodiac case in which we will be discussing the suspects. Maybe not all the hundreds of suspects, but we're going to pick some of the most famous suspects some of the ones that might be more likely to have actually been the Zodiac, and we'll talk about them on the next part. How does that sound, Zach?
That sounds great. Everyone tell your friends.
Yep. And subscribe to the channel, click the notification buttons, like this video. And until next week, I hope you all take care of yourselves.